Hello, everybody. Welcome. It is Tuesday. I had to think about that. Tuesday in California, because depending where you are, it might be Wednesday. Welcome. This is Jennifer Hart Connected, and I am Jennifer Hart, in case you did not guess that. If you're new, say hello. I would love to meet you and get connected. If you're returning, welcome back. And I am here to share information with you. Today, we have a 3-part trauma series. We are on part 2. I put in the caption the replay to part 1 if you'd like to check that out. And then we have part 3 coming up on Thursday. I believe it's June 2nd. And I'd love to invite you to join us. The replays are always available if you're not free at this time. We love to hear your comments and your feedback, what your thoughts are, what your questions might be. And also, let me tell you about why I do this. So, I've been on my spiritual path, my spiritual awakening since about 12 years ago, I think, right, like a couple years before I turned 30. So yeah, it's about 12 years. And I didn't know what was going on. I just knew I was changing, I was evolving, I was not happy, I was unfulfilled, I was working at a job that I didn't really see going anywhere. And there was so many dreams and things that I wanted to do, I had never done. And I was like, I'm done. Like, I'm done with this. Made my little bucket list. That's what actually was my catalyst. And I started doing all these things, which they were fun. And I got people to do them with me. And they were things that pushed me out of my comfort zone. I feel like I'm in that same spot again, which is beautiful, right? Because it's just a constant cycle that happens of growth and everything else. I'm very passionate about personal development. That's been my journey along the way. And I am here to share it with other people, to guide other people who are on the same path that might be going, what the heck is happening right now? I'm changing. It's weird. People don't get it. That was one of my big things, is a lot of people didn't understand. And as you grow and evolve, like, people will come into your life. And I hope that I can be one of those people for you that can help you along your journey, and just to guide you and share with you resources, information, events that you might want to attend, and people like coaches, therapists, healers especially have been so present in my life and have helped me along the way. And I want to share those resources with you. So with that being said, I would love to chat more with our panelist. I don't know where that word came from. Our panelist for today, Yamarie Negron. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Well, personally, she is my current coach right now, and I'm loving it. We are very aligned, is the best way I could say it. And I feel we just started working together, and I'm feeling a ton of shifts and support. She's very supportive already. So shout out to her. Thank you so much. And then she agreed to do this series with me, because what I like to do is I like to share what I'm up to and what I'm going through as a way. It's kind of like my makeup. Like, I do it and then I help other people, or I share my information, and that's how I become a resource. And that's what really fulfills me, is being a resource for others. Anyways, back to Yamarie. She is a trauma-informed transformation coach who is trained by the Arizona Trauma Institute. She's a certified energy healing practitioner and Canfield Success Principles trainer. Inspired by her own healing journey, Yamarie combines her experience as an empowerment coach and intuitive healer to help individuals spot the signs of hidden emotional trauma so that they can transcend their struggles and live more empowered lives. This is very true. And welcome. Hello.
How are you?
Well, you know me, I'm like, pump, pump, pump it up. I feel good today, actually. It's some days it's good, some days it's bad. Oh, I got too crazy. Hold on, let me stop my camera real quick. Keep talking.
Okay.
I'll work on it. So how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. A little tired, not gonna lie, but I am present and I'm ready to help support your audience.
Thank you for that. And I think it's really important. Can you, we were talking about this before, I'm going to throw you on the spot. Can you touch on that tired piece? Because I feel like a lot of people, let me choose my words wisely. A lot of people come on and they're always like, hey, everybody. And I'm like, that's not how it is every day. You know what I mean? Like, you're tired today. I was also tired this morning when I woke up, but now that I'm going, I feel pretty good. I can feel a little bit of tiredness, but tell us about like the whole balance thing. I want to hear.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love to live authentically, right? And even the people that I support one-on-one, which I don't sugarcoat things. I'm human just like you. I'm a spiritual being having a human experience, and I get tired. I also get anxious. that's part of why I do the work that I do. Is I've learned through my own experiences, and I eat my own dog food. So a lot, a lot. I'm a little bit stressed right now with, and a little overwhelmed with some things and responsibilities that come up. I don't think I fully thought out A, that we're in a Mercury retrograde, B, that I'm traveling in the midst of this series. And, when we decided to sign up for this, so I've just been like, the last few days since I'm gearing up for this vacation, I'm just like, oh my God, all the things I need to do before I go. So there certainly has been a lot of me having to certainly integrate what I teach the past few days, which is affecting my sleep a little bit. So I know that there's going to be some things that I'm going to have to adjust between now and Thursday so that I don't get out of my window of regulation.
Oh my God. So you're a human. Wow.
Yes, I am a human being just like everybody else.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is like I feel like what happens for me, and we're totally off topic right now, but that's fine, is that we look at these people that become role models or even idols or healers, intuitives, and we put them on a pedestal unknowingly. And I've done this for myself. So it's like it's always nice to bring it back down that we are having, although we teach people and we help others, it doesn't mean that we're not going through it ourselves. It's almost like that's the whole cycle of it. Like, at least for me, is I go through it and then I can help others with it. And you really only have to be one step ahead to guide someone else as they're coming along. Right. And then at some point, they may be able to guide you. And it's like this beautiful connectedness.
Absolutely. I mean, that's actually how Namaste came about, right? It was through, you said it in my bio, but it was through me going to the therapy and going to the shamans and spiritual healers and trying all the stuff in the personal development books and going, none of this is working for me. What is the formula? And through trial and error, similar to you and how you function through like learning trial and error, I was just like, this framework for living seems to work for me in helping me cope with my inner child wounds, my trauma, and helping me transcend whatever pain, suffering I'm going through, and use that as a catalyst for positive transformation, which is actually what we're here to talk about today, right? Is how this trauma and the wounding is affecting us and keeping us from our transformation. Specifically today, we're talking about it through the lens of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah. So what this is, if you're just joining us, I see there's some people here. Say hello, hello, and welcome. I don't know who you are unless you say hi. And we have been talking about trauma. So trauma is so important. I did not realize until the last couple years that I've really, really been digging into healing how much trauma has impacted my life, who I am, the patterns that I have, the habits that I've created. The thought system, belief systems that are running my life. And I'm like, why is not everything moving as fast as I want it to? Because trauma. So, like, first, because I don't like to ever assume that anybody saw the last one, and maybe they will go back and watch it. But let's just kind of do a brief recap of what we talked about last time. So, trauma is.
The phrase. To summarize it, what we covered last time was that trauma is anything that changes you developmentally. And this can happen mentally, physically, emotionally, and I also believe it happens spiritually. To simplify spiritual, you could think of it as it affects your belief systems, it affects your core values, which then influences how you show up in this world and who you even think you are. It influences the identity that you create for yourself. And so when we look, what we also talked about last time is when we look at trauma and what it is, almost anything can create trauma because trauma is how you respond to what happens to you, not what happens to you. And we gave some high level examples of a lot that we're going to dive deeper into for the next few weeks, a lot of examples of how that manifests and where that stems from.
Yeah, I love that. I couldn't unmute. Sorry. I was like, go. So for me, because I learn through stories and examples. So I always like to share mine. So for me, what made me really aware that I needed help and the universe guided me to you, thank the Lord, is that I have been building a business and all of this, like, I thought it would be the easiest thing because I'm like, I'm a business major. I know all the things and I have been on the ride of my life. Like selling all my stuff and traveling around the world, not that hard. Like I was like, yep, I'm called to do it. Just did it. Not scary. And I went for it. And people are like, oh my God, like, I can't believe you did that. I'm like, building a business. And so I noticed as I started to do these business things, and I was the one responsible, like all of my fight, flight, and freeze was coming up. And then I realized, like, I'm just surviving in life. Like every day is just, I'm in survival mode. And so, yeah, that's kind of how this all came about, is because I'm like, when people come to my face and there's like something like a confrontation or they're upset about something, I just like freeze. Like I'm not a fighter, I'm a freezer or a fawn. And I think we
Yes.
talked about that in the last
Mhm.
one. And so I was like, we really got to bring this trauma series to everybody and start telling them like what you could look at for yourself. Like maybe it's procrastination, perfection. I'm like, hand raise, hand raise. I can't see you if you raise your hand, but those things definitely resonate with me. And then what we're going to dive into today is actually that you can have trauma that's not your own trauma, right? Am I saying
Yes.
that correctly?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so
Love that summary.
let's talk about that. So, what we are focusing on today, we titled it Tearing Down the Trauma Tree. So, first, I want to touch on like how is trauma passed down from one generation to the next? Exactly. 'Cause that sounds mind blowing. Like when I first heard it, I was like, what? But now I'm like, oh, totally. I get it.
Yeah. So some of the most obvious ways are beliefs, narratives, and habits, right? Practices. But one of the ways that not many people understand or are aware of is that it can also happen biologically. I do want to address, is it okay if I address one of the questions from last time?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay.
Yes.
So, someone asked last time, well, can trauma be passed down from a step parent? Well, absolutely, because it is passed down, as we just stated, beliefs, narratives, and habits. So, if we have caregivers that aren't modeling healthy behaviors, that maybe are emotionally abusive, neglectful, either intentionally or not, those things impact us, right? How they show up as a caregiver absolutely influences us in our development, right, as children. Now, biologically speaking, though, when it's an actual parent, there's a few ways that it gets passed down, but the easiest way to simplify it is the science of epigenetics, right? So they've done studies. It's this theory that trauma can be passed down through the genes. Well, think of your genes as kind of like the recipe for you, right? It influences your makeup. It literally can influence. It's think of it as like it determines how you're built. So like how healthy your bones are, things like hair, your traits, a bunch of different things. So if trauma, for example, like let's say your mom is going through a stressful event, you in utero, like you're getting that cortisol pumped into your body, which is a stress hormone, one of the primary stress hormones. That can lead to things like PTSD, high anxiety. So, to simplify it, trauma can be passed down biologically for sure because it alters the genetic makeup. But then, on top of that, even if it's not passed down genetically or biologically, let's say you're adopted and obviously you have now trauma that you've probably inherited from your biological parents, but your caregivers, they're going to be projecting whatever inner child wounds and trauma they haven't resolved onto you. And statistics say, we talked about that last time, statistics say 70% of the human population has experienced at least one traumatic event. I actually think that number is very underrepresented because when we just think about global events even happening right now, right? The war that's going on, right? The economic influx that we're experiencing here in the United States. Like when we think about all the things that are going on collectively, as nations and as a community, there's a lot more trauma that isn't even being recognized as trauma that is socioeconomic and otherwise.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's so many different ways that trauma can happen, and it can be as small as something as sharing a picture that you drew for your mom, and she's like, "Oh yeah, it looks real good," and she throws it in the trash right in front of you, and you're like, "Ah, like my work is not worth anything," like, and it's
Yeah.
traumatic, right?
That can create fears around expressing yourself creatively. I actually had a client, and I think we might have referenced this example last time, but I had a client that she basically she started similar experience, but it was more with piano. She wanted to really play the piano. Her mom couldn't, single mom, trying to get by, couldn't really prioritize her nurturing her creative side. So things like painting, things like piano, her mom kind of like shunned that and prioritized logic, get the good grades at school. So what started happening by the time she came to me is just like that part of her was really imbalanced. She was really unfulfilled at, burning out at work. And she was really afraid of pursuing any opportunities that were created for her, not just from like a hobby and daily lifestyle standpoint, but literally from like, career opportunity. She was afraid to do anything that wasn't like, if I don't make dollars, it don't make sense. Like if it's not 1 + 1, it doesn't equal 2. And again, something as simple as the memory that we unearthed in while we were doing a regression was, I wanted to play the piano, and my mom was like, that's silly. We can't do that. You got to prioritize your studies, right? So yeah, something as simple as that, because again, trauma is how you respond to what's happening in your external environment internally. It's not what happens to you. And I know we mentioned this last time, but I've seen trauma literally created by, I think it was an egg salad sandwich or something in the cafeteria, and I've seen trauma created by way worse.
Right. Of course. Yes. Trauma is also obviously like things like being in a war, being in a car accident, being attacked in some sort. But I'm laughing because the example that I bring up the creativity thing, 'cause that's me, first of all, that a lot of my things that have come up is that my creativity was shut down, or I would do things and people wouldn't respond the way that I had hoped for as a little girl. And so I'm like, oh, I shouldn't be creative. And then of course the logical piece, like, so it was like, you were speaking to me. That's why I was laughing and pointing. I'm like, I just need a sign that's like, yep, that's me. So it's like, I love the messages that come through in the universe in all the ways, even when we're doing a live right.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
It creates we also spoke last time about how trauma is a multisensory experience, right? And that the brain processes trauma through all of your 5 senses. So if you're a child, sometimes I think as an adult, we can minimize like the viewpoint, the perception of a child, right? Like, so we look at some of the things we might have experienced as a child and gone, that's so silly that would create this trauma or trauma loop within me.
Yeah.
This fear of feeling safe to be creative, this fear of feeling unsafe, to speak up, unsafe to be creative, unsafe to be myself. But when you're a child and your entire world is mom and dad or the caregivers around you, like the smallest thing could make you feel like, okay, it's not safe to me to be me. And then that influences your beliefs about yourself, those narratives that get passed on. Now, talking about it from an intergenerational perspective, here's the way I want to invite everyone to look at it, right? Is like, how many people who are watching this, and it's going to be everybody as I go down the list, right? I actually like wrote down a list for myself just in case I forgot anything, but like, how many people have parents or grandparents that survived a Great Depression, right? How many people have parents who either went to war or survived a war in their ancestral lineage where there was slavery, racial violence, some kind of adverse child experience that their parents experienced, even if they didn't, right? Which most of the population has. But when I say adverse childhood experience, it's emotional abuse, neglect of any kind, but even being exposed to parents and caregivers with mental illness, right? With depression that wasn't being addressed, especially with the older generations. I mean, even culturally, I speak from a cultural perspective. We didn't believe in getting therapy. If you went to the therapist, you were broken, you were crazy, And so when we think about that, like, I want everyone to think about intergenerational trauma as like a butterfly effect, not only from a community perspective, but within your lineage. So if someone in your lineage was exposed to this, the impact that has on them, and then how that gets passed on as beliefs, as narratives, as ways of being, right? The habits, how you show up, in addition to the biological factor.
Yeah. And just to touch on what you said, it's like thinking of it as like carrying baggage. So like their trauma is their baggage. And then they have these glasses on that they see the world through the lens of their trauma. So that anytime like you might be wanting to go out and play, and to some people, it's like, it's the most dangerous thing ever. Like, don't go out to play. You can get kidnapped, because maybe they almost got kidnapped one time. They've never worked through that trauma. And so now they project, I like to give like a tangible example, like, oh,
Yes.
if you go outside, you're going to get kidnapped. Like,
Oh my
it's
God. And I heard that one. It's crazy. Again, like you said, mirroring. I heard that one a lot. I mean, especially when I was younger, I grew up in the projects and I saw a lot of like, I was probably 5 when I first saw someone shooting up on a stairway, and just crazy things that I saw and experienced. And so these things were very real, right? But like, can you imagine then to a child who hasn't learned how to regulate? If you don't have a parent who can create that safe environment and is telling you that you're unsafe, how this now can create anxiety disorders in you. Because you're constantly thinking as a kid, and it's funny because my mom, that was a big one with my mom too. And we even, how people put names on bags. My mom didn't put the names on the bags, at least not where they were visible, because it can create an opportunity for me to get kidnapped. Because now someone knows my name. So it's funny, how people like had the names. I always thought they were cool, but they had the chains with the names. I always wanted them. I never bought one, and it took me a while to figure out that this was why. I never bought one because I was like, I don't want anybody knowing my name. It'll put me in danger. Um, so these are things. When I say it gets passed on through narratives, beliefs, and practices, is how they nurture you, and then how that influences how you show up in this world. So I love that you gave that example.
And then I want to touch too on, because you mentioned the emotional abuse and neglect. So when I first started to hear these terms, I was like, oh, that didn't happen. Like, my parents were amazing. My grandparents raised me from 0 to 5 mostly. And I never knew the impact that was until I started to explore the work. And I was like, no, that's not them. But when I was able to learn what that actually meant, then I was like, oh, okay. Now that makes sense. So can you touch on that at all? Like,
Yeah,
find a little bit more clear and in a simple like example of like what neglect and emotional abuse might look like.
we're on the same page. That's exactly where I was going to go first. So I look at, just based on my studies around this kind of work in trauma, I look at emotional neglect, and my definition of emotional neglect and or emotional abuse is not meeting the needs of the child. And so understanding that, right? Like, needs are very different than wants. But again, to a child, think about being a kid. Think about being 5 years old. And mom can't, maybe it's like volatility around putting food on the table. Or, you guys maybe you have to hop from home to home because, you're always being evicted. Or even like just like some basic, like, I need certain things for school. I need certain school supplies. I need basic things like shampoo. I remember having a friend when I was actually like, I want to say I was in 8th grade. Like, they were so so poor that her mom couldn't even afford to get her shampoo, and she would have to wash her hair with dish soap. When your parents can't show up and meet a need that you have, it is considered neglect. Now, by the definition, or if we're going to stick to psychology, to me, that's my definition. And I'm being very transparent about that, because if trauma is how you respond, if that's what the definition of trauma is, how you respond to what happens to you, how I view it is any part of me that feels like a need is being neglected is going to be traumatized. That's my personal definition. I'm a little unorthodox in my approach. The psychological definition is actually like, well, like, are they putting food on the table, giving you shelter? Basically, are you meeting the basic needs?
Yeah.
But I also see it as, well, we also have basic emotional needs. We have the need to connect as well. So that parent who says, you're too old to get a hug. That parent who every time you're upset you get punished for being upset, right? Oh, you want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about. Go to the corner, or go to your room. I met someone once who literally their parent punished them for being sick. They were a sick child growing up, and because they were sick, and it's interesting because the mom was a nurse, so you would think, but the mom didn't want to deal with it, right? And she was very vocal about this. She was just like, I knew that you were different. I knew that things were going on with you, but I didn't want to invest. I was busy working. I didn't want to invest the time. So her bipolar disorder went unaddressed, and her mom would literally punish her for being bipolar. She spent most of her teen years in a room. That's neglect. Now you wouldn't think, well, like I was sent to my room a lot, that's neglect, but like these are the things that we need to think about. Were my emotional needs met? Were my tangible needs met? So I define neglect a little bit differently than maybe traditional books might. And
I
I
mean,
think the definition is expanding the
right.
more we gather the data and do this work.
Well, and I feel like this work is starting to be more focused on, and I never heard. I mean, well, obviously I didn't hear about it because I was a kid, but as long as I've been, doing this, like I just feel like the trauma piece is really starting to be explored and looked at and see how does it affect you. And like the thing with the physical, like you were saying, so the physical needs not being met, like I think back to friends that have shared with me that they didn't have food and how that can create now like trauma for I even have a lot of food trauma, I think. That's been my biggest struggle lately. So it's like I look at they always called me picky when I was young. And then they would always eat at restaurants and there was nothing I liked. So I told you this the other day. I created a relationship with bread because bread was the one thing that was always there. Every time we went out to eat somewhere, I could eat the bread to be hungry or to be full. And they'd be like, we're not going. Liz said, as I sit here and eat brownies for lunch, we're not going to go get Jennifer food after because you didn't like anything. Like you needed to like that. And so it's really interesting.
And that's exactly what I mean by needs. And by the way, I had a similar experience where it was, I could never eat. Culturally speaking, they serve, I mean, you could be 5 and they serve you like an adult portion. Like that's just how it is. And I always needed to eat in small portions. That was a need that wasn't acknowledged. I was told, like I was given the guilt trip of, there's poor kids dying in Africa and you're not eating and you're not gonna leave the table until you finish eating. Right. Again, these are beliefs, practices that were passed down. My mom didn't realize she was traumatizing me, but what this created in me is a very dysfunctional relationship. Like I can go a full day without eating.
Yeah.
And then at 6 o'clock, be like, oh my God. And so I know this about myself. I acknowledge that's that literally changed me on a neural level, but also like the habits that I've created around food. So now I try to do things to ensure that like I always have something that I can pick on, even if it's smoothies, kind of like hacking the food prep process so that I take care of myself, nurture myself, because that created, I mean, especially being punished because you're not finishing your food. Like I didn't eat the food after. I can't tell you how many times I fell asleep at the table because it was you're not leaving the table until you finish eating.
Oh my gosh. It's like I feel like that's a staple in society because it's the same thing, like eat all your food. And now I see myself eating all my food when I'm full. And so what I've actually been practicing in the last 2 weeks, this is funny, is throwing away when I'm done. And I feel so guilty about it, but I'm like, but I have to do it because it's not good for me. I'm just doing it to like eat it because that's what my belief is, right?
Yeah. So I want to make a connection really quick before we move on to like the next portion of the question. So think about where that comes from intergenerationally. Like in my example, I can tell you for sure where it comes from because I've gone through my trauma tree, right? Grandmother survived the depression.
Depression, yeah, of course. But it's probably even before then because there was so many times that they were rummaging and struggling for food. And so it was like you didn't know when your next meal was coming. You better freaking eat all your food.
Absolutely. Like I talked about how poor my grandmother was, that she didn't have money for shoes. She had to make shoes out of cardboard box. She never even had a doll. I bought my grandma her first doll in her like 70s because she loved dolls. She never had dolls. They just couldn't. She would try to make dolls out of like rice bags and stuff. Yeah. Right. So like my family had such poverty. That was then instilled in my mother, the same kind of mentality. And now she's projecting with her beliefs and her practices and how she shows up and nurtures and caregivers for me. That's being imposed and projected on me, completely ignoring my needs because there's this belief system around the trauma that they've experienced. So even if we didn't look at the biology of it, that's how that was passed down, right? Just to bring it full circle, since we are talking how trauma is passed down, the generations and how we break it.
We could talk about it forever. The one thing I do want to touch though really on is so we talked about the physical needs, like the food. And I think back to my friends that couldn't really afford clothes and they'd go to school and get made fun of because they shopped at Kmart. And that's traumatizing in itself. But then the emotional aspect is like, if if your parent can't regulate their own emotions and you have big emotions, and I am thinking of a specific like incident that I saw happen, that this kid just was so upset and the parent did not know how to do it because she's never looked at her emotions and knew how to do it. So she couldn't meet his needs of that emotions. And it was traumatic for me watching it. And I was just like, oh my God, and I'm not a parent. And I was just like, oh, I don't know how to help either.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it's like things like that in the emotional aspect. If you have anything you want to just add on that.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, we have to remember that what affects our ability to regulate. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, regulate means like our ability to cope in the midst of adversity, challenges, traumatic experiences. They're external factors and internal factors, if we're going to simplify it. So if you have a parent who's unconscious, which welcome to most of the world, and I think I did research on that, and it says 20% of the population now is doing the work, meaning actually going to some kind of therapy, doing some kind of personal development work. So can you imagine what it was before? Because I feel like this is a trend now. This is recent times. So if your parent never learned how to regulate their own emotions, explore, just as simple as being conscious. Why am I responding this way? Why am I frustrated with my child right now? Why do I feel this way? How is how I'm showing up affecting my child? If they never learn to even be conscious, just as simple as being conscious, right? Which is like a trending thing now, right? Like people are just like going through life. Then that is also going to affect how they show up for you. And so, especially when we're talking intergenerationally, we've had throughout the psychology, therapy, these things being normalized. We're still in the process of that.
Yeah.
And so I think most parents, and I always tell the people, I'm not a parent either, but I always tell my friends who are parents, I'm like, pick your trauma. Just, you're doing the best that you can with the tools that you have. Pick your trauma, because there's no way, you're human. Just like I showed up at the beginning of this and I said, and it's funny, now I'm energized because I'm talking about something I'm passionate about. But I was like, oh, I'm a little tired. Hopefully my energy levels go up. Um, you're human. You've got a nervous system. Like there's actual biological influencers. So if you have stress that's unaddressed, if you have PTSD that you don't even know about that's unaddressed, if you have anxiety that's unaddressed, and then on top of that, you're living unconsciously, it's going to be really hard for you to be the best person you can for your children. And to be
Right.
fair, that's most parents. So those of you who are actually listening to this kind of stuff and you're being conscious, like give yourself some grace, because you're never going to be perfect. And so, like, as long as you're consciously just trying to avoid recreating the pattern, you're doing a fucking amazing job.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and I want to applaud them. That's why I was doing this, for just even being open to the conversation and listening and being like, oh, because I had a friend and we talked about this last time, and she's like, "You're scared me, Jen. Like I'm gonna like mess up my kids." And I'm like, "Well, it's gonna happen. Like it's inevitable, right? So we can't go around. The best thing that people can do is to explore themselves, because I think a lot of people go, "I don't have trauma." And I'm like, well, but you do, and they don't know about the subconscious mind, and that the subconscious mind is actually 95% of everything that we do, our thoughts, our beliefs, all the things that are hanging out there. We're subconsciously like, have you ever driven home and you're like, whoa, how did I just get home? It's because it's programmed in your subconscious mind. Like one day I was going to get gas on the way home and I just drove straight home because my subconscious was like, and I'm talking on the phone and I forgot because I was not consciously thinking about it. And so if you're watching this, thank you. We applaud you. You're doing amazing for yourself. And I invite people to start looking into like Google the subconscious mind and how freaking powerful it is.
Wow.
And that's like one of my passions and missions in the world, is to empower and inspire people to explore themselves. Because I see how much I've gained from it, and I am learning and healing. And I had no idea that I knew a little bit that like growing up was a little traumatic, but I did not know the extent of it. So my grandparents used to fight and scream really loud. And I knew that there was one memory that stood out, and I feel bad, but I mentioned it to my grandma before she passed away, and she started crying and she was like, oh my God. And I was like, I'm not telling you because like, I'm trying to make you feel bad. I'm just telling you because I remember that. And I like, you guys were fighting and I went and I was crying under my crib, like, because I felt unsafe. And now that I've explored that more, I'm like, holy crap, like, wow, that created a lot of stuff. And that's, passing it down in the generational tree too.
Absolutely. And, you talked about the unconscious thoughts that pop up automatically, but let's also talk about another thing, like when we're talking epigenetics, or even what we experience and how that affects our biology. The autonomic nervous system is also affected. And what that's responsible for is all the shit we do, biologically do automatically. Not the things, the habits that we're doing automatically, right? But the biological shit, like you don't have to think about breathing. It just happens.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to think about like pooping. Go to the pooper scooper. That just naturally happens. Actually, we can tie that to one of the questions one of your members had last time too. They were like, "Oh, you mentioned stomach issues being common." Well, it's because when we're in that constant state of fight, flight, or freeze, and that ANS is affected, I tell people everything gets constricted from here down. So a lot of people who have undergone chronic stress tend to experience issues with reproductive organs, stomach, anything from here down, also lungs, but anything from here down. So, tying it back with the ANS, if your parents or you have gone through a lot of trauma, that can be severely impacted. And then that's why, like, I can't tell you how many times I work with clients and I'm watching them on the screen. They're like, I'm really anxious. I'm really stressed. I don't know why. And I'm like, they have not taken a breath, like a proper deep breath. And like the last 5 minutes they were talking to me. Right. So even something as simple as that, like I said, the ANS is impacted. Your ability, breathing is the simplest example. So we're going to focus there. Your ability to breathe. So even for myself, I know when I first started recognizing how trauma was affecting me on a biological level, that was one of the first realizations I had. I was just like, holy shit, I'm holding my breath. Oh, damn. I'm swearing a lot today. Sorry. Holy crap. I've been holding my breath. I hold my breath throughout most of the day. It's almost like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. And that came from a lot of the trauma that I experienced. Like, things like, it was a normal occurrence when I was a kid. Like, oh, there's a shootout. We've got a duck in the middle of watching TV. Shootout done. Let's go back to watching TV. Like, that was normal. Right. And so things like that kind of like trained my nervous system. Like, it just wasn't safe to be freaking alive. And so I started literally holding my breath. And so one of the things that I did to retrain myself, I've kind of Pavloved myself a little bit in a positive way. Pavlov meaning if those who are not familiar, they rang the bell, the dog, every time the dog went to get food, and then the dog would, eventually they noticed that if they just rang the bell, the dog would salivate before the food was there. What I did to retrain myself with breathing was I started creating check-ins throughout the day to intentionally check in on whether or not I was holding my breath. And I set off a timer on my cell phone. And so it would go off like I think it was like 15 to 30 minutes. It would go off. Like I would get the notification on my phone and it was like, check your breathing. And I would check and be like, yeah, I haven't really been breathing the last 15 to 30 minutes. And doing this over a little bit of time, it kind of just became a natural thing to just notice when I wasn't breathing, checking in on my body. I can feel the difference. My shoulders tense up. Part of my body feels tighter. So just that consciously, again, I think it's really important. If there's anything you guys take away from today, if the science part of it is too much for you, or if all of this is too complicated, is consciously living consciously can help heal and break the cycle of trauma for yourself and for your lineage.
And breathe.
Well, that's part of it. It's like, if you're not, be conscious of how your body's responding. Be conscious of how your mind is responding. Be conscious of how you're responding emotionally. Just be conscious on all those levels.
So the breathing thing has been huge for me. I realized how much. I remember one time I was working this event and I was so stressed out, and someone literally texted me and was like, Jen, you need to take a breath. Like, they could tell that I was like, and I was like just sitting there holding my breath, which is horrible. So the breathing thing, and I check in a lot now, and I'm like, oh, especially when I'm in situations where my nervous system starts to get, I'm like, okay, breathe.
Yeah. And that happens because, you need to breathe during a fight, but if we're talking fight, flight, or freeze, your body, the reason why it constricts everything this down is because it's trying to prepare you to take the action you're going to have to take to survive. Yeah. So I need enough energy to flee, or I need enough energy to fight. So that's why the rapid heart rate sometimes, sweaty palms. So what I want to invite everybody to look at least on a biological perspective, if they can't spot the emotional signs just yet, is start looking at how they're showing up to, like, what is it that's creating stress in them that's kind of paralyzing or triggering them to the point where they want to run and fight. And instead of reacting to that, stop and ask yourself, like, does the thing that's happening merit the response? Because for the most part, most of our fears in this era, most of our fears are self-created, right? So just observing that, going like, what is it that's triggering fear in me? And is it an actual tangible thing? So one of the exercises that I often do with individuals to help them tear down the trauma tree, so that's what we're talking about today, is there's like this diagram that I created for them. And we look at, okay, what's the fear? Because your biology is going to trump mindset any given day. Like your brain's desire to keep you alive is going to trump mindset. So it's not enough to like positively think, especially when we've got trauma in the nervous system. It's not enough to think positively to get yourself out of the situation. So let's address it. Let's write down all the fears that you have around the situation at hand. Now let's look at what you actually desire. And then let's also look at what you value and how that might be in conflict or in unison with those fears, so that we can start looking at, okay, based on all of these different variables, what can I control and what can I? And how can, because if we focus on what we can control, then we can influence the results, or we can at least approach the situation with more ease. You know, like I'm going to give a personal example for this really quickly. And I know we've got like 10 minutes left, and I think we've got like another question or two to address. Because of this generational trauma, especially around money, when I have suffered adversity in my own life financially, or when the bank account gets lower than I'm comfortable with, my brain literally would go to, I'm going to be poor and I'm going to live under a bridge. I'm literally like it would go, it sounds funny, but this is literally what was like it to me. Oh my God, I'm going to live under a bridge tomorrow. It would go to that extreme, that cognitive distortion, catastrophizing is what we call that, right, in the psych and trauma world. And this was a very real thing to me. Like I would go into extreme anxiety, extreme panic attacks. I felt like I couldn't move, I couldn't think, I couldn't do anything, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, right? And so when I was trying to positively think my way through it, that wasn't enough. What I had to do was not only co-regulate, like I can't stress enough how having other individuals around you who can help regulate you in a time when you're at your peak in distress is so important. Community, guys, is so important. So how I had to get through that process was by reaching out to the individuals that I knew could stay cool, calm, and collected and help ground me, bring me back to reality. Be like, Yamarie, these are the things you're not seeing because your prefrontal cortex right now. That's not how they spoke to me, but I'm just explaining it for the folks here. When our body's in a state of like, I need to fight or I need to flee, we're not thinking logically. That part of the brain shuts the fuck down, right? The body is literally taking over just to give us enough energy for that. So I would have to bring myself around individuals who could be like, here's how you look at the picture, the full picture of what's going on. And here's the actual worst case scenario. You're not going to be under a bridge. You've got family and friends that love you. It's not going to be an ideal scenario, but here's where you're likely to end up, right? Even if you don't like it. And here's, by the way, what you can do to address it. And so that exercise helps you do that on your own. And I can share that with your audience if you want. But it's also important to seek therapy, seek coaching, and have friends and support system around you. Like if you don't have that in your immediate environment, go find it outside of you, because it's important to help people that are going to help you reframe so that those stress hormones can start coming back down.
Yeah, and the support piece is really huge. Also, like people who are educated or informed, in my opinion, is very important because I've always been a fixer. That's my trauma. And so people would call me, and I'm still always actively working on this. I want to fix it. And I'm like, I don't just listen. I do more so now, but I'm like, oh, but let me tell you this, and you could do this, and you could do this. And so it's like having the right type of support is important too, where that's where like the therapy or the coaching comes in, because they have been trained how to support you, how to ground you, how to co-regulate, as you said. And when you say regulate, you're meaning regulate the nervous system, like when we're in
Yes, regulate the nervous system, bring down that cocktail of stress hormones so that you can take action that's more balanced logically. So what I tell individuals that work with me is we never want the mind to be completely in control, and we never want the heart to be completely in control. We want them to have a conversation with each other, which is why the exercise that I do with people, one of the exercises is focusing like, so one of the anchoring statements we use is, I want to do X, but I scare myself by telling myself that X, so we can get clear on like all the fears and how much of that is perceived and how much of that there is rooted in some truth. And then look, balancing that with the heart aspect of what's my desire? What are my values, so that we can make decisions that are more driven by that versus the fear.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so we got about 15 minutes left. And what else do you want to touch on? Because I know we talked about, we were going to, and I think naturally we've talked about all the things, but how trauma is passed down from one generation to the next. What happens when emotional and psychological trauma goes unresolved? I feel like we've talked a lot about that. And then how treating your trauma can break the cycle of the pain in your lineage for generations to come.
Yeah, so I actually think we covered all of that, but I'm going to just remind people, because we didn't go so week one, I felt like we went deeper into the how it manifests.
Yeah.
That second question. So, it can manifest in so many different ways, from depression, like if we're talking physiological changes and things like that, and mental changes, it literally can change the way that your brain is wired. So when we talk about the science of neuroplasticity, right? Like you can train your brain to not be anxious in situations. What was the example you gave for yourself earlier? Like, was it about saying no to people, setting boundaries?
Oh, well, that's true. Yes. I don't think I used that one earlier, but yeah, if I have to confrontation, like if there's confrontation or boundaries, like I told you the other day when I said no to something, I was like, my nervous system went haywire because people pleasing and boundaries has not been something that I was taught. And that was done in our household, like uniformly. I don't know if that's the right word, but like it was not consistent. There we go.
Yes. So you can retrain the brain to support retraining the nervous system, to learn that what you learned was unsafe is safe.
Yeah.
And so and how we do that, well, we have to practice awareness first, awareness of how we show up in those situations and how we're responding, right? So like, unless it's a lion or tiger or bear, or to be fair, you are in a situation with a abuser that is unsafe for you. For the most part, it's not unsafe to like have healthy like confrontation. And for anyone listening who's having relationship issues, confrontation is actually really healthy for relationships, and it's something that creates passion. It's just we want to learn healthy confrontation, right? What's unhealthy is the running away from the problems and things like that. So yes, it can manifest as depression, alcoholism, mental illness, all those extreme things that we associate with trauma. But how it can also manifest is self-sabotage. Dysfunction in relationships, dysfunction in careers, extreme highs and lows. So what I want to invite everyone to do is look at patterns. Is there a pattern that's being recreated in my life and even in my lineage, right? Like I've noticed a pattern, especially when it comes to the women in my life, unhealthy relationships with men, big pattern that I'm breaking right now, cycle that I'm breaking right now. And it needs to be broken. We talked about it in week one. So, I do recommend people go back to the week one video, because we went over a lot of good things in a little bit more depth, and also certain aspects of today at a higher level. But really looking at that pattern to ask themselves, okay, so how did this manifest as belief systems in me, which are tied to the emotional aspect? How did this manifest as like, what I think about myself, what I think about partners, whether I'm in same-sex relationships or not, how I think about the world, and because remember that perception literally is reality. And so what you believe, so a combination of everything, what your nervous system believes is unsafe, what your mind believes is unsafe, what you believe is unsafe is going to influence how you show up in this world. So look at the patterns in your life. And if there's any pattern that you're like, that's not helping me live the life I really want to have, that's not helping me get to where I want to be, that's not helping me have the relationship, experience the career growth, whatever it is, then you want to do some thinking around what are the thoughts, what are the beliefs, what are the feelings associated with this, how does it manifest in my body, so that you could start going through a process of reintegration is what we call it. So teaching the brain and the body that it's actually safe to take steps in that area.
Yeah, I love that. And then I love the fact that you said like the self-sabotage, because I feel like for me, I have a lot of characteristics of being ADHD, but I went and got tested a couple years ago, and they're like, no, you're not ADHD. You're right on the cusp. And then they told me that I actually had bipolar disorder too. And so, and what was funny is immediately I was like, oh, hell no, because the stigma of having, a mental illness disease, I rejected it. I was like, I don't think it's that. I think I'm just a human being that has trauma that needs to be healed. I mean, this is my own opinion of myself. And I checked in with a lot of people around me too. But now that we're talking about the conversation and you mentioned like the ADHD, it's like probably more so comes from what I experienced growing up and like working to heal and reset the nervous system and retrain the brain and all of those things.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that for a second. I always tell people that, ADHD just means that you were really traumatized, either through epigenetics or in your childhood, right? Because if we think about what creates that scatteredness, it's the nervous system was so dysregulated that now it's like everything and nothing is a priority. Like, again, I talked earlier about how the prefrontal cortex is affected during fight, flight, or freeze. So imagine that happening so often that now it completely throws you out of dysregulation. So it's not that these things don't exist, is that when you look at a lot of the autoimmune diseases, mental illnesses, or emotional disorders that are out there, they're all tied to stress.
Mm-hmm.
Stress is the root cause. Again, I said trauma earlier. The definition is how your body responds. Well, a really traumatic, stressful event puts so much stress on you that your mind, your body changed.
Yeah.
Your mind and your body changed. So the two things that you mentioned, even bipolar, right? That is extremes, highs and lows in mood. Well, we've talked a little bit about how it affects your hormone levels. So if we're constantly getting cortisol, dopamine, of course that's going to influence our mood, right? If we don't have the ability to regulate our nervous system, of course that's going to influence our mood. So what I've seen personally, not that I'm perfect and I'm still on this journey with you guys, but I smiled a little bit when you talked about ADHD, because I used to joke, there goes my undiagnosed ADHD again. And because when I think about my 20s, I didn't know any of this stuff. And I was so dysregulated that I really had issues with scattered brain and lack of focus and things like that. And how I worked through it was, I don't know if anyone's heard about the Pomodoro technique, but it's basically like 20-minute sprints. So I came across Tim Ferriss, and that's actually how I learned about this. And through mindset work and stuff, I started consciously working on it, which led to me being able, then I became one of the most focused people ever. Like I became that person who was like, I could be focused on something. What I can do in 3 hours, it takes most people like a full day of work, right? But I had to train myself. So if I could train myself to do that, again, science of neuroplasticity, the same way our brain learned it, we can unlearn it. And I am by no means, by the way, guys, I know we're talking a lot about the body and physical today, but like I am by no means an expert in that. There's an expert that we were thinking about bringing on for a bonus session to talk about that.
Second week of June is the earliest we could coordinate that, but we should do that.
Okay, awesome. But I want to invite everybody to look at themselves as multifaceted and dimensional. Like, you have a physical body, and we shouldn't ignore that. If you're having symptoms of any of these things, we should address it. And sometimes it takes a holistic approach, modern medicine, traditional medicine, and then doing the emotional processing work and mental work as well. So, avoiding categorizing, and more so like focusing on addressing root causes. That's how we should be.
I love that. Yes. I'm like, and we'll have to talk about that later in my sessions.
Absolutely.
I haven't seen any questions come through, but if anyone watches this and they have questions about this series part, drop them in the chat box. If you have questions, we can address them on the next one, which is Thursday, June 2nd. And we are going to be talking about, and it's kind of like, it's just such a huge topic. There's so much that we could say about so many things. We're going to be talking about from triggered into triumph, how the relationship between triggers and trauma exists, why your triggers are a secret ingredient in the formula for taking back your power, and from traumatized to triumph, a proven framework for healing unresolved wounds and living a more empowered life. Well, that needs to be sooner than later. It sounds amazing.
Thank you. Did we address the what was the last question? I don't know if I wrote that down.
The last one was how treating your trauma can break the cycle of pain in your lineage for generations to come. Oh, the question was getting the trauma or the pain in the shoulders. And you had mentioned like when it comes in your body like that and your pain in your back tense up, how do you overcome that?
Oh, okay. Yes. I'm like, I feel like we missed something. So that was one of the questions that one of the audience members
on the last one. Mm-hmm.
So, you know, they're not going to like this answer, but trauma is very complex. You just need to get the support and get the help, right? So it's literally addressing it on all levels. You can do somatic stuff to support you with the actual physical relief. But what I have found right on my journey is that when you heal things in silos, so I go get the physical therapy or I go get the somatic therapy, I do the acupuncture, but I'm not also simultaneously addressing the mental and emotional things that are tied to that. The healing cycle is incomplete. And so then we just recreate that cycle of suffering. So for that person who said that is definitely get support identifying the root causes of, and by the way, for that specific person, I actually did get a channeled message earlier. I want to say that it was tied to mom. So it was tied to a mother wound. And yeah, I'm feeling it on my lower left sacral right now. So it was, and I should have written, I don't think I wrote down notes for it, but for that specific person that asked the question, they know who they are. It was tied to a mother wound. So anyways, I digress. It's, you've got to do the physical, actual physical healing around it. You've got to, and then you've got to process the emotional stuff around it, and then do the mindset work that's going to support and reinforce those physical habits and those emotional habits that you're developing.
That's really, really a good answer. And I can see now why you said they're not going to like it.
Yeah, it's a layered approach. And I feel like we're going to be healing from something, all of us healing. And I'm trying to find a new word for that till like the day we die, because that sounds so doom and gloom. But it's like, if you could start looking at it as not necessarily healing, but evolving. You're going to be shedding layers.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, you're going to be shedding the layers of, when we talk about breaking cycles, I look at it as there's two kind of people in this world, right? The people who are traumatized and showing up from the space of that trauma and are conscious, or the people who are carrying the burden of breaking the cycles of that trauma. And so I actually see it as an empowering thing. Is like, which one of those two do I want to be? The person breaking the cycles and saying like, this ends with me, or the person who's just now become a victim to their circumstances, right? And so if you can just accept that, like, you know what, we're always going to be unearthing some other thing that's a part of the human experience, and I can use this to help me become better, grow, thrive. It's a lot more, I don't want to say seamless, but it's a lot easier to swallow and integrate than being like, oh my God, this is so hard, this is so burdensome. It's like,
well, life is either happening to you or it's happening for you. Okay. If you choose that it's happening for you, then you are dancing with it. You're dancing in the conversation of life. Like, okay, what's this here to show me? And then when you're able to look at it and be open to that, you can see so much more, and you can see the way out to proceed forward and which path you should go, or just choosing to look at it as a lesson or something, because exactly what you said, it's like you grow every time. I feel like I am passionate about doing the work. Well, it's a whole nother conversation. You don't want to like 100% focus on it, because we are whole, perfect, and complete as we are today, right now. There's nothing wrong with us, but I like to do the work because I feel I have a big mission. And the more that I do the work and shed and release and grow and expand, I can reach more people. I can have a bigger impact on the world. And that's my why. And, for people who have kids, like, be the best person for your kids. Like, you do the work, and then that trickles down, you know?
Exactly. And that's part of the mindset work. But to give them an answer, how I would approach it for them specifically, because I always look at the body as the last resort. Like the body is your is the last resort for, it's like, okay, screaming at the trauma, screaming at this point, is start with the somatic stuff. Start with maybe, exploring acupuncture, exploring somatic therapy, cranial sacral, regular massages. Start with the physical. But while you're doing the physical, then start working on the mindset, which is what you were talking about, and the emotional, working on those two maybe side by side, as they're getting the physical stuff going on too.
I love that. The whole approach. If anyone has any questions, please let us know. We hope you enjoyed our live today. We will be back on Thursday, June 2nd at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you to Yamarie for joining us and giving us all of her wisdom and insights and examples, just all the good stuff. I love you to pieces, obviously. I'm a little biased because she's also helping me through my stuff. And so it's really fun for me because it's like real time. We come on and we talk about things and I'm like, yes, like we've been learning that and working on it. And then I get to share my own experiences. And I hope that people will get to see my transformation as I am being aware of these things in my own life and taking a stand for myself to look at them and to break the generational patterns that have been happening. And I said, stops with me.
Yes, absolutely. Love that.
All right, everyone. Have an amazing day. Thanks for joining us. And we will